African History, World War, AI and the Growth of African Nationalism. World War, AI and the Growth of African Nationalism. World War II was a military confrontation between the Axis powers led by Germany of Adolf Hitler, Japan of Emperor Hirohito, and Italy of Benito Mussolini, and the Allied powers led by France, Britain, and later USA and USSR. The war broke out in 1939 with German invasion of Poland, and lasted until 1945 when the Axis powers were defeated. The war began in Europe, but fighting took place all over the world. In Africa, the war was fought in North Africa, Northeast Africa, and the Malagasy, now Madagascar. European powers like France and Britain recruited Africans their colonies to serve in the war as fighters, cooks, nurses, drivers, storekeepers, scouts, and porters. Britain took about 374,000 African servicemen, while the French colonial office recruited over 80,000 Africans. Africans who served in the war included Bildad Kaga, Dedan Kimathi, and War Review Idot General China of Kenya, Jeona Jaini of Malagasy, now Madagascar, Leopold Sedar Senghor of Senegal, MZ, Mohammed of Zanzibar, Jean Bedel Bokassa of the Central African Republic, Ahmed Ben Bella, and Belkacem Karim of Algeria, Sergeant Olossi from East Africa, etc. Nationalism among the Africans did not come about until the beginning of World War II. Before this time came, there was only a limited amount of African nationalism among the elites of the colonies. In reality, the form of nationalism that was present at the time was not nationalism at all, it was anti-colonialism. Reference questions: how did World War II influence the growth of African nationalism? Assess the impact of World War II on the growth of African nationalism. See to what extent did World War II contribute to the growth of African nationalism. Impact of World War II on decolonization of Africa. 1. World War II created political awareness among Africans, which influenced them to demand for immediate independence. During the recruitment of Africans, European colonial masters claimed they were taking them to fight against German imperialism and restoration of a free world in Europe. African servicemen like Bildad Kaga got exposed to ideas of Western democracy. In 1945, while in Britain, Kaga campaigned for the Labour Party against the Conservative Party. Upon returning to Africa, the ex-servicemen of World War II organized uprisings against European colonialism with an aim of establishing similar African History, World War, AI and the Growth of African Nationalism. Algeria 1954–62. In Kenya, General China and Dedan Kimathi led the Mau Mau uprising against the British 19,521,955. 3. World War II exposed Africans to the weaknesses and conspiracy of the white men. African servicemen were surprised to see that Europeans could die of the same bullet that killed the Africans. It shocked them to see European soldiers run away from the battlefields. Africans witnessed the existence of slums and a destitute kind of life among some Europeans. The Africans also came to learn that European colonialists were only interested in independence of European countries like Poland, but not Africa. All these destroyed the invisibility and superiority of the white men, hence increasing African anti-colonial sentiments. 4. Consequently, the military losses suffered by the major Allied powers during and soon after the war had impact on African patriotism. In Southeast Asia, Japan overran and pushed the British out of Malaya, Hong Kong, and Burma. The worst defeat faced by the British at the hands of Japan was the loss of Singapore. After the war, the Indonesians defeated the Dutch while the Vietnamese humiliated the French in the presence of their African subjects like Ben Bella, leader of the Algerian Revolution, and Jean Bedel Bokassa, who later became president of the Central African Republic. The defeat of European colonialists by yellow people encouraged African peoples to organize struggles that would mark the decolonization of Africa. 5. The end of World War II led to increased European exploitation of resources in their African colonies. The war negatively affected European powers in economic terms to the extent that where it ended, colonial masters like the French and the British immediately ran to Africa to seek economic remedy. They targeted African mineral resources, African human resource or labor, and cash crops. More mining and trading companies came to Africa, while labor exploitation worsened as colonialists implemented compulsory growing of cash crops. Heavy taxes were imposed on African natives as European colonialists tried raising resources to reconstruct their economies ravaged destroyed during the war. This continued European exploitation increased African suffering, which influenced them to express their nationalism. African History, World War, AI and the Growth of African Nationalism. African labor and the general suffering of Africans. This led to African hatred against foreigners, hence causing them to fight for political freedom and self-determination. 7. The Second World War led to economic boom in Africa. During the war, many of the African resources and commodities were highly demanded for in Europe. These included minerals and cash crops. Groundnut oil from the Senegal, palm oil from Nigeria, cocoa from the gold, Coast now Ghana, coffee from Ethiopia and Ivory Coast, uranium from Congo, Leopoldville now DRC, and copper from northern Rhodesia now Zambia found their way to Europe. Besides, some European investors relocated their investments to Africa, which influenced increased growing of cash crops, expansion of mining activities, and the emergence of small-scale industry that employed many Africans. In colonies like Kenya, Africans were allowed to grow crops like tea and coffee which they were previously denied. All these improved the socio-economic conditions of Africans. First, trade unions were created to fight for workers' rights. Then it enabled peasants to pay for their children's education, and later, they could afford to fund political activities geared towards attaining independence. 8. The Second World War led to increased urbanization in Africa, hence influencing the growth of African nationalism. This was due to white settlers, who developed towns and improved on the transport network. Such towns included Nairobi in Kenya, Suez in Egypt, Salisbury now Harare, southern Rhodesia, Accra and Cape Coast in the Gold Coast, Algiers and Sétif in Algeria, and Lagos in Nigeria, among others. The growth of urban centres attracted African populations to settle in mining centres, towns and ports. Africans who flocked to towns in a large number shared ideas and experiences and suffered from the same problems of unemployment, discrimination from the whites and high costs of living. The conditions in the urban areas frustrated Africans who easily mobilized and united themselves under anti-colonial movements to struggle for independence. 9. The outbreak of World War II led to the liberation of Ethiopia from Italian occupation in 1941. Mussolini joined the war on the Axis side led by Hitler, which worsened his friendship with Allied powers of France and Britain. The French and the British approved the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, expecting Mussolini to stay away from Hitler. The Allied powers were disappointed by Italy, hence diverted their support towards Ethiopia through Sudan and consequently, Italy withdrew her troops from Ethiopia to concentrate in the Second World War, which also enabled Ethiopians to defeat Italy. The victory of Ethiopia over Italy inspired the hope of Africans under colonialism that European powers can be defeated. Then, during the course of World War II, the Atlantic Charter was signed in August 1941 between Winston Churchill of Britain and Franklin Roosevelt of USA, with Stalin of USSR as an observer. The Atlantic Charter called for self-determination of all peoples through its Article III, which acknowledged the sovereign right of states under foreign domination, and for the African history, World War II, and the growth of African nationalism, colonial people to choose a government of their own. The resolutions of the Atlantic Charter on self-government and sovereignty existence of states under domination were adopted by the United Nations Charter of 1945. The Atlantic Charter influenced African nationalism through calling for independence and improved livelihoods of the colonized people. 11. The Second World War influenced the Brazzaville Conference of 1944. General Charles de Gaulle, the French leader, called a meeting of representatives of French colonies of West and Equatorial Africa. The aim was to find ways of thanking Africans for supporting France in the Second World War and for standing with the French during trial moments when Germany occupied France. At the conference, the French administrators also laid strategies to divert African attention from demanding for independence. The conference proposed political reforms in French West and Equatorial Africa, which included the establishment of native assemblies, increasing African representation in the French Parliament, and allowing African participation in administration. The political reforms created political awareness of Africans to demand for independence, instead of keeping them silent and naive as the French colonialists thought. 12. World War II led to the rise of USA and USSR to the rank of superpowers, replacing Britain, France and Germany that had failed to protect world peace. The USA and the Soviet Union had an anti-colonial attitude, thus they encouraged colonial powers to decolonize. The new superpowers wanted to be free to pursue their trading interests in Africa but could not due to the colonial restrictions established at the Berlin Conference in 1885. USA also wanted to spread the ideology of capitalism while the USSR would spread communism. They therefore provided logistical support to African liberation in form of morale, finances, weapons, and scholarships for education. The USA and the Soviet Union used their influence in the UN to call for immediate independence of African colonies, and this encouraged the development of African nationalism. African history, World War II, and the growth of African nationalism required to promote political developments, changes in their colonies aimed at preparing Africans for independence. 14. The war led to the coming to power of the Labour Party in Britain that influenced independence agitations in British Africa. Shortly after World War II elections were held in Britain, with the Labour Party of Clement Attlee defeating the Conservative Party of Winston Churchill. The Labour government under Clement was liberal, initiated political reforms in British Africa colonies which included new constitutions, i.e. the Burns Constitution in the Gold Coast and the Richards Constitution in Nigeria, both in 1946, and increased African representation in the Lecture. These political developments increased African morale for Independence. 15. The end of World War II led to the calling of the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, which increased African desire for self-rule. The conference was organised by Africate-sentents like W.E.B. Du Bois and George Padmore, and was attended by many delegates from Africa like Kwame Nkrumah of the Gold Coast, one of the secretaries, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Assistant Secretary, Kamuzu Banda of Nyasaland, and Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria. The Manchester Conference encouraged African nationalism by recommending that freedom fighters must form political organizations and involve masses in the struggle against foreign rule, and the use of military means of non-violence was ineffective in achieving self-rule. The conference influenced the return of Africans from abroad to lead independence agitations, hence Kenyatta returned to Kenya in 1946 while Nkrumah went back to the Gold Coast in 1947. 16. World War II weakened European colonial empires in Asia, which affected the rise of African nationalism. The end of the war led to the notable independence of India and Pakistan in 1947. Independent India immediately joined the Union and increased on the members of the General Assembly who voted in favour of total decolonization of the whole world. India had to extend financial, technical and military assistance to enhance the African struggle for independence. India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru became a political counselor to many of the African nationalists like Apollo Milton Obote of Uganda and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. The success of Gandhism non-violence in India inspired many freedom fighters in Africa like Kwame Nkrumah of the Gold Coast and Albert Lutherley of South Africa to employ defiance campaigns, boycotts, demonstrations and strikes as part of nationalist activities against foreign rule. 17. World War II exhausted and depleted the resources of Allied powers like the British and the French. This followed the high investments made in the war and the shattered economies during the war. The French and the British suffered economic challenges like inflation, low export volumes and unemployment due to poor industrial performance during the course of African history. World War II and the growth of African nationalism. War. The post-war period witnessed loss of colonial will of the British and the French to continue administering Africa, and instead preferred to put more effort in restructuring their nations, which were heavily destroyed by the war. The colonial masters gradually withdrew from Africa, hence creating the opportunity for Africans to achieve independence. The 1941 Atlantic Charter and African nationalism. By 1941, World War II had become fierce. It led to the financial decline of the Allied forces, who sought for help from the USA. Led by the British Prime Minister Churchill, Allied alliance met the US President Franklin Roosevelt at a battleship of the Atlantic Ocean. The result of the meeting was the US support to the Allied powers. Roosevelt and Churchill hence signed the Atlantic Charter in